The constant buildup of tension within the narcissistic personality style is a chronic feature of this personality. For some folks, it's like a volcano that erupts regularly. For others, it's a slow burn. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's always lurking. Two researchers named Mark Hardaker and Elias Tassanikos, who are from the University of Roehampton, King's College in the UK, and the University of Crete, published a very interesting paper in 2020 on how narcissistic people process information or stimuli, in this case, how they process words. They used an interesting experimental method by which they could present words on a computer very quickly. And in one experiment, they presented sort of negative words like worthless and incompetent. In another experiment, they presented positive words such as attractive or exceptional. Their methodology is probably more than I could get into in this video, and we'll have the reference for it in the video notes if you want to look it up. But what these researchers would do is they'd sometimes present the negative word, a negative word, after what we call a negative priming word. That would be something like harm. And sometimes after a neutral word. And they did the same thing with the positive words. They'd use a priming word and then present the more positive word. They would also vary how quickly the words would be presented on the screen. And doing all of this allowed them to look at what would happen when there was a really short interval between the presentation of a priming word and either a negative word or a positive word. What these researchers found was actually really interesting. They use a test called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, and the specific subscale, something we call the superiority scale. For people who had higher superiority scores, when they got a negative priming word and then they were quickly presented with a negative word, what they found was that those more superior narcissistic people would react more quickly to the negative words, like worthlessness. This, interestingly, didn't happen with the positive words. And it didn't happen when there was a little bit more time between the priming word, like harm, and the actual word, worthlessness. The more time, the less likely there would be these differences in how people responded. It's an interesting finding. And it appears to relate to a narcissistic person's sensitivity to words that would highlight themes such as worthlessness. And it happens when the word, the negative word, is presented very quickly after the priming word, which supports the idea of this being a defense, since it is a reflexive, almost unprocessed reaction. Their work suggests what most of us working with survivors of narcissistic abuse and narcissists know, that narcissistic people are forever vigilant for threat, especially a threat to their fragile sense of self. They are almost programmed to detect it and react to it, as though they're trying to inhibit their feelings of inadequacy and feelings of shame as quickly as possible. If they even have a minute to process, a few extra seconds to process what's happening, people who are narcissistic are actually able to quickly regulate. They didn't respond as quickly to that negative word when there was more time between the priming word and that negative word, like worthlessness. But when they are primed, and it's backed up quickly with a negative word, then boom. Without that second to catch themselves, those narcissistic folks who have higher superiority scores will react more quickly. That suggests that superiority is a defense. It's not a true belief in their own greatness. And the suggestion of threat through the negative words means that they start looking for more threats. And when another negative word comes up quickly, they react really fast. This did not happen with the positive words. So those positive words, like attractive, aren't as activating they aren't activating their attentional systems. And it makes sense because those words don't signify threat and impending shame. Now, what the hell does all of this mean for managing narcissistic relationships? It means a lot. This finding gives a scientific boost to what anyone who has managed a narcissistic relationship has observed. The high reactivity to anything that could be slightly perceived as a critique or an insult or a slight. And this research should suggest that especially when that's the vibe, negative words, and a person higher in narcissism is primed for negativity based on what they are seeing or hearing, they're going to react that much more quickly. This article, in essence, provides some of the brass tacks and sort of granular substantiation of why all of us walk on eggshells around narcissistic folks, because they're so quickly ready to snap when they don't like what they're hearing. This research once again reminds us that our garden variety conceptualization of narcissism as a preening, arrogant, superior person is actually just a look at the mask, a sort of window dressing. And that as soon as they think bad news or criticism or anything that isn't perfect is coming, the mask falls off. And what is underneath that mask is their inadequacy being activated, and even their attentional systems are just more tuned in to the negative stuff. Narcissism is, in that way, a personality style that is associated with greater threat perception. And that greater perception of threat means that there is greater defensiveness. And that is why we see the projection and the denial and the edginess. It doesn't change a damn thing about your life. It's just a reminder that there isn't much you can do to fix this. This article, though, and their findings remind us that there actually is something a narcissistic person themselves could do to help fix these patterns. They can actually wait a minute. That moment of pause seems to be just enough to regulate. But unfortunately, this research suggests that when the perceived threats come too fast, the person higher in narcissistic superiority reacts faster. Pausing and mindfulness may be the single most useful approaches in addressing narcissism, but are also the hardest skills to acquire, especially for people with these personality styles. Now listen, I am always heartened when I see that the science supports the clinical observations and people's experiences who are going through narcissistic abuse. That hair trigger response of the narcissistic personality, their ability to perceive threat faster than other people, that's clearly happening in the attentional centers of the brain. And hey, maybe that's why narcissistic people cannot pay attention when the rest of us are talking. Maybe it's because their attention is so focused on responding to perceived threats that may be coming from what we're saying that they don't have anything left for the rest of us. This finding, though, this research is one more reminder that you aren't the one who is seeing something that isn't there. Trust me, it's there. And it's literally at the level of how people who have narcissistic traits, and in this case, more of the superiority traits, how they differentially process information. And that can help all of us understand why these patterns so quickly can spiral out of control. So much of the time we spend talking about narcissists is about how grandiose they are and how they're bullies and how they're often very successful. Fragile doesn't always seem to add up, but it's actually the origin of this whole problem. The fact that they are fragile, that their self-esteem is inconsistent, that they're so reliant on other people for validation and admiration and to tell them who they are, is so because they're so vulnerable in some ways, and that their ego is so fragile, and that they are so insecure. And that fragility is what makes them so combative, what gets them so angry and prone to rages and dysregulated and dismissive and contemptuous. In that way, fragile people are often angry at the world because it's a miserable way to go through life. It can make things that make life more peaceful, like searching for meaning or purpose or being able to stay in the moment. The things that leave us sane, it's harder for them. Because they're fragile, the environment feels like it's chronically full of threats, that everywhere they turn around there's someone who's out to get them, someone who's saying bad things to them, somebody who's going to let them down. So there's an almost infantile, almost childlike presentation, as it were, in people who are narcissistic, because they do feel so fragile. There is a vulnerability. We often don't think that. Again, they can be so bombastic and so difficult and so vindictive and so many other difficult things that it's hard to get our heads around the fact that they're fragile.
In fact, it's that, and then when you do get there, there's a risk, like, oh, they're fragile, I want to rescue them. It's not that kind of fragile. Fragile people can actually be somewhat dangerous because when they're cornered, they get very scared, and scared people can be dangerous. You can certainly be compassionate to it, and that's always been the message that I've tried to put forth, not only about narcissism, but on towards any human being, is that there is no need to be cruel to them, even if they're being cruel to you. When you can understand that it's their fragile sense of self, their fragile ego, that often drives them to do the unpleasant things they do, it can often allow you to more compassionately set your boundary with them. Don't expect them to say thank you and say, oh my gosh, thank you for recognizing how fragile I am. It takes a very long time in therapy, if ever, for them to recognize what these patterns are inherent in themselves. You're not the therapist. But it does mean you can be compassionate. And when you can recognize that this pattern of fragility is so important to who they are and how they behave, sadly, it also allows you to not take it so personally. Because they're fragile, that's why they react angrily. You can step back and say, this isn't about me. This is them. They're feeling fragile. I can get that. And when you don't personalize it, it may not completely make it unpleasant, but it does allow you to not blame yourself for it and waste all of those futile hours and wondering, what could I do differently? What could I do differently? What could I do differently? From a parenting perspective, it's a wake-up call to all parents out there. You might wonder, how does a person develop a fragile sense of self? It starts young. The only gift we can give a child is a solid sense of themselves. And frankly, sometimes even with the best of parenting, it's not enough. Our children come into the world with their own temperaments. The world does what it does to them. So we can't protect them from everything. But we can sure as heck do our best to pay attention to them, give them consistent, safe spaces, be kind to them, love them unconditionally. That's really what parenting is about. And get them to eat their spinach from time to time. And you've pretty much done your job. That sense of fragility often comes from a childhood characterized by more anxious attachments, a lack of consistency, chaos, neglect, and in some cases, abuse. All of those things can culminate in a person having a very, very fragile sense of self-esteem. And in that way, many narcissists have really had sometimes a rougher start than other people. And that can explain where some of this comes from. Not always, though. Not always. And some parents out there with adult narcissistic children may say, you know what, I thought we did everything right. And I do think it's very important that although a lot of this is developmental, there's still very much a temperament, biological piece. A person can come into the world with a very sensitive temperament. They come into the world fragile. And no matter how much we try to shelter that and develop that, you can shore them up a little bit. But that fragility may be something that dogs them into adulthood. We can only do as well as we do. But I do hope that some of that understanding on sort of the fragile place a narcissist comes from, it doesn't become a call to arms to you to try to rescue them, but perhaps regard them with compassion, not only for them, but for yourself. Be able to maintain healthy boundaries and not personalize it.
Now, a couple of months ago, a brilliant scholarly article written by doctors Sophie Kirovic and Brad Bushman from Ohio State University took on the big topic of the association between narcissism and aggression, and they did this in a very comprehensive manner. This paper is one of the best examinations I have ever seen of this issue. The authors looked at the results of 437 existing individual studies as a means of drawing their conclusions. The power of this methodology of looking at many studies is that this is not just the conclusion of one study. This is the cumulative evidence that is piled up across hundreds of studies examining this issue in studies and samples around the world and across different types of population. Now, what Kirovic and Bushman found was that regardless of gender, culture, age, the way the research was designed, and of how aggression was measured, and how narcissism was measured, the findings were absolutely consistent. Narcissism is clearly associated with aggression. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, you can say that as big as you want, Dr. Ramani. Big surprise! I already knew that. But the fact is, maybe we did suspect that, but in the world of science and of policy, individual stories aren't enough. This study is groundbreaking because the authors were able to show very clearly that this association is universal. This is no longer a speculation. I mean, the scientist in me needs to see the data, and these researchers were able to show it. The real brilliance of this article, though, is that because they looked at so many studies, they could look at these issues of, for example, of aggression and narcissism measured in so many different ways. When they looked at aggression, they framed it in different ways, including physical aggression, verbal aggression, direct expression of aggression, for example, directly aggressing against a victim who is right in front of the aggressor, and indirect aggression, for example, a smear campaign against someone. An important component of aggression that they captured is something called displaced aggression as well. Think of that as being in the presence of someone who is having a rageful episode that you witness, but that rageful episode is not necessarily directed at you. And they also captured under aggression both online and in-person bullying and online trolling or provoking people online. All of these things taken together accurately were captured under their definition of aggression. Now, one thing that was particularly striking to me was that the authors observed comparable associations between grandiose narcissism and aggression and covert/vulnerable narcissism. They found it, and aggression. They found it regardless of the type of narcissism. Another important finding is that narcissism was also associated with something called reactive aggression. Reactive aggression is provocation-based aggression, as well as what they call proactive aggression, which is to aggress against someone without provocation, but instead you do it because of some other incentive, maybe to gain advantage or to dominate someone. And they found a comparably strong association between narcissism and actual violence, meaning that narcissism is a risk factor, as we call it, for dangerous and violent behavior. Interestingly, Dr. Bushman's other research, he was one of the authors who was one of the authors on this paper, has also done his own prior research suggesting that narcissism is a risk factor for mass shootings, something many of us who do this work on narcissism have suspected for a long time, and he was able to pull together the data and the science on that. There's long been a belief that narcissistic people are hot-headed, meaning that they're aggressive when they feel provoked. Where this study that I'm talking about was so striking is that, yes, that is true. But they also found that the narcissistic personality is associated with aggression even when there is no provocation. So that actually raises the risk level associated with this personality style. Provocation does matter because provocation does in fact increase narcissistic aggression, which holds up a model that other people have brought up of this idea that aggression is an ego-protecting stance in narcissistic people. That's something that's been suggested by other past researchers like Ray Baumeister. But since the research suggests that even in the absence of provocation, there is aggression, ego protection is not the only function that aggression is serving. A really fascinating cultural finding also emerged in their research. Narcissism was associated with violence and aggression, regardless of whether it was conducted in a collectivistic or individualistic culture. Now, the authors were very clear to point out that much less of this research has been conducted in collectivistic cultures, but in those studies that were, they found similar associations. The traditional belief that's often been out there is that this idea of collectivism, that this may be protective against this link between narcissism and aggression, that didn't bear out. And in that way, the association between narcissism and aggression supersedes all the protections of a collectivistic cultural bias. This goes beyond a message that in an individualistic culture where it's every person for themselves, this suggests that there's something embedded within the narcissistic individual, regardless of whether the culture is about the group or the individual. Now, when I read this study again and again, and I've even had the pleasure of corresponding with the authors about it, which was a tremendous honor, what struck me is the danger we have in society when we minimize and when we play down the impacts of this personality style. The tendency that we have of just sort of lightheartedly viewing narcissism as just sort of vain, arrogant, preening, and pretentious, but nothing beyond that. This research suggests, one more brick in that wall, that this is dangerous. There are so many important implications in the findings of this research paper. In the area, for example, of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, this implies that the unique dangers of narcissism in these spaces, because since the nature of intimate relationships, the closeness, imply that there's going to be a greater likelihood of these so-called provocation episodes, even about small issues, and then a risk of even more violence. In the area of workplace violence, there is the implication in these research findings that narcissism is going to result in more dangerous workplaces. In the area of public safety, for example, Dr. Bushman's work on mass shootings and narcissism suggests the risks that are inherent in that. In our day-to-day lives, that narcissism is actually something that is essential for legal and justice systems to understand, for politicians to understand, for policymakers to understand, for public health officials to understand, and for educators to understand, and above all else, for mental health practitioners and researchers to understand. I have no idea what the hell prevention looks like when it comes to narcissism. Let's face it, narcissism isn't against the law, but it sure is a risk factor for lots of dangerous illegal behavior and dangerous behavior in general. However, there is very little I believe we can do to prevent it, because that would require a wholesale takeover of parenting and early childhood development. Good luck with that. Now, this isn't just about an annoying or gaslighting partner. That's not all that narcissism's about. It's not just about a manipulative parent or a cheating ex. This paper suggests that narcissism is about a real societal danger associated with a personality pattern that society is more often than not likely to enable. We make narcissistic people our leaders, our heroes, and we view their lives as aspirational. We are, in essence, revering the very patterns associated with personalities that make the world a more dangerous place. If ever science was a wake-up call, it's in this article. Now, the full citation for this article, for those of you who are interested in the research, or students or therapists or academics, go pull it, because the reference is there. I can't recommend it enough. It is one of the most important pieces of work I have read in years. Really, congratulations and gratitude to Drs. Kirovic and Bushman for this work. Those of you who are interested in it, really take this article in, because the data, all of it, is some of the most compelling stuff I've read in a while. It always helps when we suspect something in the world of narcissism, when people put in the years of work, and I know this work took them years to do, to really show that the data supports a link here. And the more we have these supportive links through the data, the more that there may someday, probably long after I'm dead and gone, but there may someday be a willingness to see these patterns and understand them. So we might actually be able to help people who find themselves in these situations, help them not only become safer, but possibly create policy that might potentially make this world a safer place. Let's talk about the so-called tension reduction hypothesis, or really the question, why does my narcissist keep harassing me until I respond and get angry, and then they calm down? Tension reduction is a concept that comes up a lot when we are understanding a range of personality styles as well as different kinds of dysregulated behavior, such as impulsive anger, aggression, and violence, substance use, and even self-harm. In short, in a person who struggles with tension and appropriate management of that tension, they will have the tension ramp up in them like a head of steam. And then they will either blow up or succumb to the behavior that maybe they're trying to resist. And then, boom, they're fine. You will be ragged from the abuse, but then after they throw their tantrum, they're fine. In fact, may even throw in a gaslighting barb at you like, oh, come on now, stop making a fuss. Yeah, I know I was mad, but it wasn't that bad. So what does this look like? Now, any of you who have been in any form of narcissistic relationship, whether in your family, in an intimate relationship, or in the workplace, you have gone through this. Here's an example. For some reason, a person with a difficult or narcissistic or antagonistic relationship in your life, they experience an ego injury of some kind, a narcissistic injury. It may be because something didn't go the way they wanted in some area of their lives, that you are friends with someone and because you have this friendship that got them mad, that you're friends with one of their business competitors, that you aren't giving them the answer they want, or that you said something that brought up their insecurity, or you didn't read their mind. Then they may start texting you. It may start slow, but then it keeps going and going. The texts start to turn into word salad. You know what I mean? Those texts that are so long that you need to press that little button and then they turn into a big document that fills up your phone. Anytime you get a text that long, it's a problem. It's not unusual for these texts to come into your device one after the other, or in bizarre hours in the middle of the night or in the early morning. On the basis of conventional narcissistic relationship wisdom, what do? You don't respond. You gray rock. You don't take the bait. And then they escalate. For them, the narcissist, the tension keeps rising. They keep texting. You don't respond. They keep texting. At this point, they may even be engaging in thinly veiled threats, or maybe not so thinly veiled. They may even threaten to do something dangerous or hint at that. You get concerned and you respond to their text. In many cases, this may either change the direction of these mounting texts or stop it. They may get angry and will get mad at you for not responding. You may respond in a very brief way and they'll want more responses. You may respond quite kindly and they might actually de-escalate, but the tone might change. Because what the tension reduction hypothesis in narcissism, it's as such that they need a reaction. They can't regulate, so they escalate and they escalate. And then once you finally respond to them in a way that they want, it's as though the tension is released, and they may actually start wondering why you are reacting so strongly. They may release that tension by screaming at you, but then it's out, and then you're upset and they don't get it. I had this happen once to me recently where the person kept texting. The nature of my work is such that it may sometimes be 5 to 6 hours before I can return a message because I'll have back-to-back clients or teaching. People who know me should know that. But I guess there are enough people out there who are entitled who just keep going. I also shut my phone down at certain times on the weekend and night just to set a boundary and give myself a break. This particular person started small. They sent a few memes, they sent some videos, they sent some other stuff, and then more pointedly started stating their displeasure because I wasn't getting back to them. And then some middle of the night text that took up multiple screens on my phone, and then some early morning ones. Maybe that person stayed up all night building up with that tension. Those texts were thinly veiled and not so thinly veiled threats. My phone was actually off for a lot of this. So I finally looked at the tension-induced meltdown after 12 hours of having my phone off and calmly replied in a therapist-y way, and the person calmed down. This person could not regulate and had to have a response. They felt entitled to a response. The person was actually mildly terrifying, and so I wanted to de-escalate the situation. But I could see the almost immediate tension response. They were even conciliatory and tried to sound like a grown-up, all calm and composed and reasonable, after sending me text diarrhea for 12 hours. These tension escalations and breakdowns can happen by phone, text, email, or even more frighteningly, they may just show up. Or if you live with this person, it can manifest by the person following you around the house, room to room, yelling at you and blocking doors. Narcissistic people with that tension have to have their reaction. They feel entitled to their reaction. Much like a tantruming child, they have to throw themselves down on the ground, at least metaphorically, and get a rise out of people, and then they get exhausted. It's an adult tantrum. These tension reduction episodes are a prime example of the dysregulation that characterizes narcissism. Usually, we see their dysregulation as rage, but the tension reduction is their need to let loose on someone. If they can't yell it out, it's not out. For the rest of us, we do not have that luxury. We don't get to throw a tantrum. We have to find appropriate ways to vent. Therapy, journaling, a run, a shower, a drive when we cry, or where we cry, a chat with a friend. We do not stalk someone until they respond to our meltdown. Again, we should have aged out of that stocky tantrum style at around age 3 or 4. The buildup of tension is deeply uncomfortable for them. And remember, narcissistic people don't do discomfort. Instead, they make it someone else's problem. I have seen many a narcissistic person survey the damage after one of their tension release episodes. Terrified people, in some cases even restraining orders, people who have quit working for them, people who have ended relationships. Narcissistic people will often think that people are overreacting. They just needed to let off steam, after all. And yeah, sometimes they might even say, yeah, I guess I could have done it differently, but gosh, why is everyone making such a big deal out of this? I just got mad. And when it's explained to them why, they actually do get it. They're not psychotic, but invariably, they do it again. When a narcissistic person is not in their tension-induced state, they actually may have some preserved insight and recognize why it is not okay, but will say something like, I couldn't help it, or it's not that big a deal. I've been under a lot of stress. Like I said, unless they are psychotic, they can help it. They chose not to help it, and then slowly get enraged that there are consequences to their behavior and people are calling them out. The constant buildup of tension within the narcissistic personality style is a chronic feature of this personality. For some folks, it's like a volcano that erupts regularly. For others, it's a slow burn. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's always lurking and contributes to the eggshell walking we so often see in narcissistic relationships of all kinds. The tension release meltdown in every narcissistic relationship is always around the next corner. Some folks with these personalities turn to drugs and alcohol as part of this cycle, which invariably makes it worse, or they're walking around perpetually stoned as a way to sort of numb out these dysregulated states. You may wonder, after they wreak so much havoc, blow up your phone, or come at you in some unrelenting manner, why they are so calm after the blow up. After they release it, they are so calm that they may in fact criticize other people for being so worked up. It's a gaslighting chaser after a terrifying tantrum. Think of it as psychologically explosive vomiting. Once they get it out, they feel better, but the rest of us have it all over our shoes and our clothes, and that is not very pleasant. So that buildup of tension, that explosive release, because things aren't working out the way they wanted, and then once they get their blow up done, they're kind of like, everything's fine, and they resent that other people were bothered by it. Very classical relationship pattern in a narcissistic relationship, and I hope that helps you make sense of the chronic tantrums you feel like you're always having to deal with in your narcissistic relationship.